the Center for Imaging Science. And today it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Andreas Savakis. He is Professor in Computer Engineering here at RIT, where he previously served as the head of the Department of Computer Engineering for a decade, more than a decade, a long time. He received his BS and MS degrees in electrical engineering from Old Dominion University in Virginia, and a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from North Carolina State University. Before joining RIT, he was senior research scientist at Kodak Research Lab, and his research interests are many and varied. He's had a long career, but been doing a lot of work in adaptive learning, object tracking, activity recognition, change detection, some deep learning, and computer vision in general. Professor Savakis has co-authored over 100 publications and holds 11 U.S. patents. He received the NISTAR Technology Transfer Award for Economic Impact in 2006, IEEE Region 1 Award for Outstanding Teaching in 2011, and he's received numerous other awards. He serves as Associate Editor for the Journal of Electronic Imaging and IEEE Transactions on Services and Systems for Video Technology. So please join me in welcoming Professor Savakis.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for coming today. I want to talk a little bit about learning this afternoon. And as I get started, I wanted to thank the people who actually did the work. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge Brett Minahan. He's engineering PhD student here at RIT. His work has involved object tracking as well as deep learning and domain adaptation. Sharif Azari got his PhD in computing here at RIT in 2014, and he has continued a little bit of work that will be mentioned in this presentation. And then Sriram Kumar got his master's in electrical engineering last year, and he's now working for a startup. The topics I would like to cover today, I'd like to start with an overview of why we need it with a motivating example, why do we need adaptive learning, and for that we're going to talk about the data set bias. Then we're going to discuss some adaptive learning with regard to subspaces, followed by adaptation, domain adaptation, using manifold techniques, as well as deep domain adaptation. So let me start with a motivating example, which is work that Brett did on pedestrian detection from aerial platforms. That was done about a couple of years ago, and there were not good data sets for pedestrians from the air. There were a lot of data sets from pedestrians from street level view, but not so much from the air. So what Brett did is he created his own data set. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And essentially used a screening approach first, using a proposal method called edgebacks. So this is a method that screens areas that are object-like, have enough object-like characteristics to be considered good candidates, whereas other regions like the background may not be so interesting, so why bother to run a classifier there? And after he got the proposals, then he ran a deep network on that, very similar to others that have been used in pedestrian detection, but specifically tuned to finding pedestrians from the air. Now, as far as the data sets, he used 3 different data sets. We can see here the first data set is the first row, positive and negative examples. That was called UCF ARG trained data set. The second one is an evaluation data set. ARG evaluation was the name of it. And the third row is called UT Tower data set. And from where you're sitting, they may look very similar. But if you look at the characteristics more closely, the second one is higher resolution than the first one. The specs are here. The original one used for training is 960 by 540 at 30 frames per second. The second one is 1920 by 1080. Whereas the third one is lower resolution, 360 by 240. And even with the resolution difference, when we tested on one and then trained on one and then tested on others, we found significant differences in performance. If we were to train on similar data that what we tested on, we found excellent performance, over 99%. If we go to the high resolution data set, we get a drop in performance just simply because the resolutions don't match. And a low resolution, even worse drop in performance, which suggested that where we train on is very important, and maybe there is some bias into the data set that we train on. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening. There is a paper that came out in 2011 by Nefros that mentions the data set bias effect. In fact, what happens, there are a lot of data sets in computer vision, and everyone tries to maximize performance for the given data set. But by trying to maximize performance, what we end up doing is overfitting to that particular data set. And even though we get the best we can out of the environment where we trained, if we change environments to something with a different look or different characteristics in general, we may actually do worse, a lot worse. And in fact, they put a game together called Name That Dataset. Simply from the look, maybe you can identify which dataset is which, right? So they give you the dataset, a few images in the top, they give you the names in the bottom, and you can play around and try to match them. If you match them perfectly, 12 out of 12, there's a little kind of congratulations note that floats in the bottom and tells you, maybe it's time to take a break because you're memorizing the data set. You're not really learning, right? So that's why what we want our classifiers to do, to learn the data sets as opposed to memorize them so they can generalize to other environments. And we have two paradigms of adaptive learning. One we're going to call incremental learning, also known as online learning or continuous learning. So let's say you have a face recognition system, maybe in your phone, if you're lucky, right? And then you start growing a beard, right? So this changes slowly over time. New data comes in. Every day you have maybe longer beard. So you want to adjust to that particular effect. Other than beard, maybe some other things change, right? Maybe your hair, maybe your pose, maybe the things you're wearing, makeup, and so forth, right? So there you have to train the classifier to incorporate these new looks that it has not seen before so it can become more effective, even though things change gradually. Now, do we want to retrain the whole thing from scratch with all the data? Do I have to keep all the data ever gathered? Or can I incrementally, just based on the new samples I just received? The second example is kind of a more drastic change. Maybe I trained in an environment, then I go to a different city, or I go to a desert instead of a forest, right? And things look very different. There, the appearance may change, maybe the sensor has changed, the background has changed, and I have to compensate for that. So that's called domain adaptation. I have to adapt to this new domain. Because there are changes in characteristics, like these are some standard data sets. Let's say I used a webcam in the bottom row versus a DSLR at the top row. They will look different because the sensor is different. Or maybe something I pull off Amazon will look different because it has a different background and illumination and general characteristics of the image. So here, we want to compensate for that change in characteristics known as domain shift. And what we say is we train one domain that's called the source domain, and we want to do well in something different called the target domain. This process can be unsupervised or unsupervised. If it's supervised, I have at least some samples where I know their labels. So maybe I know this is a backpack or a headphone or a laptop. That makes life a little easier, right? Even if this number is small, I can do something. Some cases I have no way of labeling data, right? I go in a new environment, I have no idea what it's with, what nobody has labeled things. So the system has to adapt without knowing that's unsupervised adaptation. So let me start with the first example, the incremental learning, and then go into the domain adaptation part. So here, I get a few samples, they are labeled, and I have to adapt what I do, but in an efficient manner. So the objective here is being efficient, as opposed to trying to improve performance. In the long term, I might improve, as people change in their looks. And the method we're going to use is subspace learning. And let's talk about how to form the subspaces. For a particular class, for example, that we may have, in this case, let's say I'm in a feature space, different colors represent different classes, samples from different classes. I want to group all these samples and form subspaces, each subspace representing a class. And then each of those subspaces will end up being a point in a manifold called the Grassmann manifold. So formally, the Grassmann manifold is the set of all n-dimensional linear subspaces in a particular dimensional space. So if one class A is one subspace, second class is another subspace, if I can compute the distance between them, I can tell if they're close or apart, and if a new sample comes in, I can classify depending on where it lies, in which subspace it is closer. The easiest way to do that is by using angle measures, but these are not quite as effective as some other methods. It turns out there is a way to compute actual distances on the manifold by doing kernelization. So I built first my subspaces using principal component analysis on the samples that I have for each class. Then each subspace I represent by a basis. And then using these bases, I form some kernels so that I can do distances between subspaces and then do classification any way I like. So this is the example. We have, say, every subspace for a different person. We have some features. These features then we map to form a basis function, and each one of these is a point on the manifold. Now, if we get a new image, maybe we want to adapt the subspace because we have new information we can use, but we want to do that effectively. And that's where incremental learning comes into play, and there are many algorithms for incremental learning using PCA or signal byte decomposition. The one we use is called the Grassmannian rank 1 update subspace, and it is efficient in that it works in linear time. So if I were to keep updating my subspaces and I look at, say, different data sets, and I keep increasing their size by increasing the number of samples I receive, the update using the incremental method is in the bottom in the red. So you see it's always equal effort by adding additional samples, whereas if I were to do the full rebuilding of the subspace, I would have more and more and more work to do because the number of samples keeps increasing. So this is an efficient way to build my classifier updating with incremental learning. Now, as far as domain adaptation, as we said, we want to learn in one domain and be able to apply that knowledge in a new domain. And how can we do that? In general, we have features and classifiers that work together in the classification process. So I could either adapt my features to try to match one domain to the other, or I can try to retrain my classifier to incorporate knowledge from both domains, or I can do a little bit of both. Now, there are both manifold-based approaches and deep learning approaches to domain adaptation. As you can imagine, the manifold-based approaches are maybe 4 or 5 years old, and the deep learning approaches are maybe current or 1 or 2 years old, right? So everything is kind of shifting towards deep learning given the success of deep networks. I'd like to talk about three methods that we have used in manifold-based domain adaptation. One very popular method is called subspace alignment, and the other two are geodesic subspace sampling and geodesic flow curve. So with subspace alignment, again, we build our basis for the two domains, the source domain, where we originally trained, and the target domain, where we're now about to test. And what we want to do is align those two subspaces the best we can, so that the knowledge from one domain can be transferred to the other domain. The thing is that this is an unsupervised process, right? So I don't have any information of how to align them exactly, so I have to find some criteria. And the criteria we're going to use are in terms of divergence. So we're going to make the alignment so the divergence between the features is minimized. Okay. Now, as far as the subspace sampling, as we mentioned earlier about the manifold representation, we can use a similar representation to actually work with a supervised domain adaptation. We're going to take our features from the source and target domain and map them on a manifold. So one side has the source and the other side has the target. Now the subspace sampling is going to look for intermediate points on the manifold between the source and the target domain. And what we want to do is find the intermediate representation that will work well for classification, so that we can incorporate knowledge from both domains in the classification process. The geodesic flow kernel is doing a similar approach. Again, we map on the manifold and we have the source mapping on one side, the target mapping on the other side, but it creates a continuous representation across the manifold and tries to find the best discriminating point for doing the classification. So because it's continuous, it has more flexibility in doing the representation that captures both domains. So how can we improve upon these methods? One way that we thought about making them more robust is using the L1 PCA and bringing that into a manifold formulation using the L1 Grassmann manifold. So the idea is that, again, we're going to form the basis for each class that represent a subspace for that class, but instead of using the standard PCA, we're going to use the L1 PCA. So what's the difference? As you may remember, with principal component analysis, we try to find the components that minimize the variance of the reconstruction. In other words, that capture the most energy in the direction where they're pointing. And to do that, we do an optimization that involves the L2 norm. The thing with the L2 norm is that it is susceptible to outliers. So if we have, say, a representation up in the top with blue, and we have some outliers with red, the L2 norm will try to compensate for the presence of those outliers. And in many cases, it might overcompensate, so we're going to lose the representation of the rest of the points. We're going to lose accuracy in the representation. Whereas the L1 PCA would be more robust to those and will do a better job of capturing L1 PCA. The catch is that L1 PCA is much harder to compute than the standard L2 PCA. And up to recently, there were only suboptimal methods to do that. We found a paper that came out in 2014 by Panos Markopoulos and co-authors that actually presented an optimal way to get the L1 principal component using an optimization method called bit flipping. And it turns out that since that time, Panos has actually joined RIT as faculty member in engineering, so that was our good luck. But anyway, we used his method to get those principal components. And now we can actually perform a GSS using L1 or GFK using L1 and have a more robust domain adaptation process because we're getting rid of some outliers that are really not necessary to compensate for. So if we go to the data sets, there are kind of some object classes that are very typical in a data set called Office data set, and they are from Webcam, DSLR, Amazon, and Caltech. And what we did is we implemented geodesic subspace sampling with L1, compared it with L2, and also geodesic flow kernel with L1, and compared it with the L2 geodesic flow kernel. And in general, we did fairly well compared to the standard methods by providing more robustness using this type of L1 subspace representation. Now, if we look at how many dimensions we need for the representation and at which point performance starts to degrade, we found that consistently about 25 or 30 components were enough to capture variation, but if we try to increase the components very much, the performance across data set drops because more and more components capture more and more detail, but this extra detail may be domain specific. It's not really class specific. So what we want to do in the adaptation, find the best point of operating where we capture the information about the classes where we want to discriminate, but not the information about the domain where they're represented. So it's domain invariant recognition. Now, as far as deep learning, there is a lot of activity in deep learning, as you know, and deep domain adaptation is also popular. How do we adapt our network to a new domain? Just to give you an example, at the very top there you see two data sets representing digits. The digits look familiar, but the look is a little bit different, right? So if we train on one and then try to recognize on the other, maybe we will run into trouble. So I'd like to talk about some of the more popular methods in deep domain adaptation. There are more, of course. One is called domain adversarial training, adversarial discriminant in domain adaptation. This one was at CVPR this year, asymmetric tri-training, and unsupervised transductive domain adaptation. So let me start with domain adversarial neural networks, or DAN. What this method does is uses backpropagation in a little bit of different way. So if we were just to train a network, say put an input there and supervise how well you can do, we would propagate the information up, make some comparison with what we want, and then propagate back the error so we can adjust the weights or parameters in the network so that it can learn better. Now, there is an extra branches to this network because we want to differentiate the classes from the top branch, but in the bottom branch, we don't want to be able to differentiate the domains. Because if the features differentiate the domains, that means that they are influenced by these domains. If they can't tell which domain it came from, that means the features are more universal and they can work across domains. So what the authors did here is they introduced something called gradient reversal to work with the bottom layer so that they can try to build features that cannot tell the domains apart, but they can tell the classes apart. So that's domain adversarial neural networks. The next one is called asymmetric tri-training approach. So this one uses the expert approach to kind of figure out information about new samples. So we go in the target domain, we don't have labels for these samples to adjust to or to adapt to. So it says, I'm going to ask two experts. And what experts can I find? Classifiers I have built, right? These are the best experts I can find. So I'll have two classifiers I built, and I will ask both of them to classify an unknown sample. If they both agree, then I will assign that label to the sample. If they disagree, I will not use that sample to adapt. I will only use samples to adapt that the two experts agree on. And then the ones I have actually figured out some way to label them by expert consensus, I will try an expert classifier to be able to adapt to this new domain. Okay? So that's the tri-training approach. Another approach is the transductive domain adaptation. So here we have, again, the samples in the source domain. Let's say in the top here, they are labeled. So every label here is represented by a different color. And we also have the samples in the bottom, which are from the target domain, and they don't have labels. So what that does is trying to find an association between what the nearest neighbor are for each sample in the target domain from the source domain, so we can do a label association. And finally, we have the adversarial discriminative domain adaptation. So this one uses adversarial training to assign the labels and do the adaptation. So what is adversarial training? As you know, the adversarial networks are also very popular nowadays. So they are based usually in having two competing kind of entities. One of them is called the generator, so it generates some samples. And the other one is called the discriminator. And the discriminator tries to look at the samples that the generator generated and say they are from the same source or they are from different source, right? So the generator is trying to fool the discriminator, while the discriminator is trying to keep the generator honest, if you will, right? That's the adversarial nature of learning. And if the generator generates samples in a way that the discriminator cannot tell them apart, that means he has succeeded, right? He can actually match the two domains. So that's a concept that they use here in adversarial domain adaptation. So they start with a classifier, as you normally would start in the source domain. They train it in the source domain, and then it remains fixed from that point on for the second stage. The second stage is the adversarial adaptation, where you have a generator now getting samples from the target domain and trying to map them into features such that the discriminator cannot tell them apart from what the source network generates. So the discriminator in the beginning is going to be able to say, well, this from the source and that from the target, they look different. So they come from different domains. But eventually, as this gets trained more and more, the discriminator will not be able to tell them apart. And at that point, you know, you have learned how to map features in a domain invariant manner. Once you have that, you map your features with what you have learned during the adversarial learning, and you train a new classifier or adapt your classifier to be able to do your classification in the target domain. So as you can see, there are a lot of different approaches in doing the domain adaptation. Now, in our case, we have proposed a new approach. Again, this is Brett's work, and that involves a few different steps for doing what's called manifold guided domain adaptation. So we're going to do label assignment by looking at the features and making associations between the features from the source domain and the features from the target domain. And the first step is going to be adaptive batch normalization, and that's sort of to condition the features to have similar statistical properties. Next, we're going to use the subspace alignment method that we talked about to align the features between the source and target domains. And then we're going to do clustering in source and target and try to do an association so we can do the label transfer. And once we have the label transfer, then we're going to retrain or adapt the classifier to be able to work in the target domain. So this is kind of a graphic of how the process works. We're going to start in the source domain, and train this network as we normally would from the source images. Then we're going to use PCA to get the basis representation for those features. And then from the target side, we're also going to get the base representation and do the subspace alignment. The difference is that in the case of the source images, we're going to have labels, whereas in the case of the target images, we're not going to have labels. And now we're going to make some association in order to do label transferring. And the way we do that is by looking at clusters, both in the source as well as the target domain, and making associations between cluster centroids so that then we can do the label transfer based on the closest correspondence between the cluster centroids in the two domains. Now, once we have those new labels, then we can go ahead and adapt the network by retraining, transfer learning. Now, some examples. These are some digit data sets. MNIST is a standard data set. Then we have MNIST-M at the far right bottom, which is kind of a variation, artificial variation of the MNIST data set. It involves color and change in tone. Then we have the USPS, and then SVHN is very different because these are actually from street signs, numbers from street signs. And they're not necessarily just one number. Sometimes you may have part of a second number and so forth. So then how would the adaptation work for these cases? By the way, this is the network. It's a fairly small network. In general, the resolution of this image is small, so we can have a really large network. So it has a couple of convolutional layers and fully connected layer, and then the softmax output. Adaptive batch normalization, we do every few samples, every mini batch. And the idea is we try to whiten the data, in other words, turn it into zero mean and unit variance. And we do that for more consistency between the feature characteristics from source to target. Now, if that's all we did, and then we run a test, we get some improvement, right, in most cases. So what we have here is the source on one side and the target on the other side, source and target, source and target. And in most cases, you see, we get some improvement. But the question is, can we do better than just using adaptive batch normalization? Then we go to subspace alignment. And in this case, so if we just use the original classifier, that's the first row, then classifier with adaptive batch normalization, second row, adaptive batch normalization plus subspace alignment is the third row. And here, in some cases, we improve, but in many cases, we don't. We actually drop in performance. So that puzzled us a little bit, and we decided to look into what it all means. And to do that, we looked at how the features actually look. But to visualize features in their high-dimensional features, it was hard to do, and we used a method that's called TSNE representation, and that one just shows the feature layout in just 2 dimensions, so it's easy to visualize. And we saw that in some cases where it worked well, the features actually clustered nicely after we do the subspace alignment. So this is just the original classifier. Then we have adaptive batch normalization, and then subspace alignment. And here we see that the source and the target, they align well in general. So then here it's easy to make the level association from source to target. And here we also see that the source is the more difficult data set, where the target is the easier data set. So it makes sense that we can go from a harder data set to an easier data set. In some other cases, it didn't work so well. So in these cases, if we looked at the features, we saw that after subspace alignment, the clustering was not desirable, right? They didn't cluster in a way that we can make meaningful associations between feature clusters. So then we looked at as for a way to tell how well the clustering would take place, and that would involve something called the silhouette score. So to compute the silhouette score, first we compute the centroids of each cluster. Then we look at the average distance between cluster centroids. And then we look at the average distance within the cluster centroids. And by comparing the two, we get the silhouette score. And depending on what the silhouette score is, if in a situation like here where they cluster nicely, the silhouette score is low, so that means it's fine. But if the silhouette score is high, that means that either the clusters are too close to each other or their points are too dispersed, and that causes a poor score. And if the clustering is not good, maybe the label transfer will not be good either. So that gave us a guide on how to do the label transfer. So we start with the label transfer. We do the pairing between clusters, and then we do the transfer only if the silhouette score is reasonable. And once we have the new labels, we retrain, or if the label transfer doesn't work, we just stop and we don't continue. We just use what we have. And this is kind of an example of our results and how they compare to some state-of-the-art methods. In the first two cases, the clustering was good, and we could do adaptive normalization followed by subspace alignment followed by level transfer. If the clustering is not good enough, we don't do the subspace alignment, we stay there at the adaptive source normalization and original classifier. And then compared to the other methods we talked about, DAN, ADA, ATT, and so forth, in most cases we can do better than the method depending on where we start and where we end up. And just to visualize this a little better, we have a case that works well here. You can see the clusters are formed nicely, and we can do the label transfer, which then gives us a very good result at the end, over 91%. Here are some examples of some correct classifications and incorrect classifications in the target domain. Remember, we start at MNIST and we target USPS. So these are some examples. You can judge for yourself, what it all means. That example goes from the street numbers to MNIST. That one also works well. We get almost 98% accuracy on that transfer. And again, here the errors that we get compared to some correct classifications. And then some examples where the clustering is not very good. Because of the silhouette score, we stop and we don't do the label transfer. Okay. And here's another one. So typically, if we go from a difficult one, more complex one, to a simpler one, it's easier. But if we go from a simple one to a complex one, it's usually harder to generalize. But that's just a rule of thumb. Okay, so as far as what we have done in adaptive learning, we talked about different ways of doing adaptive learning using increments of new information for incremental learning, or actually doing adaptation to a completely new domain. And we can take a lot of the existing methods that involve subspace learning and make them more robust with level 1 PCA. We can also work with deep domain adaptation And we have proposed a method to do label transfer by looking at the features on the feature manifold, clustering them, and making associations if it works out, so we can improve the training and adapt to the new domain. And these are some publications that are relevant if anyone wants to learn more. And thank you all for attending.
We have some time for questions.
So go back to slide 63. So in this case, the yellow dots are essentially not clustering very well.
Yeah.
But there was one method that did well with this, right? This was MS to SVHN. What was the method that did well with this?
Oh, which, on the results?
Yeah, the table of comparison from MS to SDM.
That's the last column, right?
So, yeah, so why did AT&T, what's the characteristic of that algorithm that allowed it to pull apart that tight group of yellow dots and make sense of it?
Well, first, let me say, this is not very good. It's only 53%, right? It's 10
Yeah.
classes, so it's much better than chance, but it's really not very good performance because it's such a hard adaptation to make from a very simple one to a very complex one like the straight numbers, okay? Now, the asymmetric type training was the one that was based on the experts to do this was the asymmetric type training. You had the experts, if they agreed, then we took that label and assigned it to the new sample and used it for adaptation, okay? So it's just a little different approach. And I don't think we can draw very general conclusions because there's so much variability in the data, right? For one example. So compared to that method, I would say in a lot of the other examples, maybe they didn't run it or they didn't do so well. Like in the second column, they got 85%. We got 98%. So, yeah, this is also a fairly new method. This one came out in just this year in the archive, so it's very, very new. And we're competitive with that.
Right?
I think you talked about your architecture. I think it was around 45 or 46. You can go back.
You mean the network?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No.
This one?
No.
This
Yeah,
one?
right here.
Okay.
So I'm just curious, in that model where you go into PCA, subspace alignment, what is that? Is that that's a fully connected layer, but is it the final layer, an FC8, or is it an FC7, or what is that?
Well, this is not a very deep network, so it's not.
I mean, equivalent though. I mean, is it
yeah.
the final classification, or is it something before that, before the final
So
classification?
Brett is right there. He can answer the
It's
question.
the-
That's why he's here.
The layer before the before the classification layer.
Yeah,
Right
but it's
before.
only two convolutional layers, right? It's not.
Yeah, there's two convolution, and then there's the fully
Yeah,
connected. and
so
the
it's not
classified.
that deep in this case.
I have a question. So do you think you could directly optimize for the silhouette score? So what it looked like you were doing was if the silhouette score was low enough that
Yeah.
you would proceed, otherwise you wouldn't. Do you think you could do more end-to-end learning? Like I've seen this
That
thing-
would be preferable,
Yeah.
obviously. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
That's an idea.
We really want end-to-end training. So end-to-end, instead of training one piece at a time and keep going like that, you just train the whole thing in one big soup so that it becomes more efficient, basically, right? So, yeah, we need to work on that, definitely.
Yeah, there's something people have been talking about the past week called center loss. I wonder if that would be, we'll talk offline. But
Okay, yeah, very good.
More questions? Okay, well, let's thank Andreas one more time. regularizing this is like, I don't know how Java or generalizing, but people are doing like some guy. I don't even know if he has a paper on that, he's a block whereas he uses what's the decentralized.
Я только понял общая идея.
One is just standard like classification, the other one's like distance laws, and then so they show that I think the blog was very very nice. Like it made everything cluster together where it's rather far. Right? You can train end to end.
Okay. Yeah, that's
So nobody's using domain ever showing that it would work better for something else. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Sounds ideal then.
It just doesn't feel
On the output, yeah.
It seems like there should be some way to have a well-posed optimization problem that's
Oh, well, AlexNet requires a big input, 34. This is only 32, it's very small. So it's not good for AlexNet. For other examples,
I have to go to, I'm giving a talk, but I participated in the paper, but didn't do much. And I'm still giving the talk though, and I'm like, and the student was saying, well, I'll do there. I'm like, oh gosh.
I did when I was a PhD student, I had to give a talk for a fellow student that I wasn't even going to co-author because he couldn't get a visa to get him to the US.
This is how it's done. I was trying to get him to get some visas. This guy's a visa problem.
Okay.
Like it's a paper where I helped edit, made suggestions, but it was his idea. He did all the work.
FC is the full
I
quality
got
layer.
answer 5 minutes for a question.
Well, you
Don't
can
ask me questions.
just expand the talk to an extra 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I should do. I should do the talk.
That's what I don't know, is that if I just take
Exactly 12 minutes for 12 minutes for the talk. And you
You can use it, yeah, you can use it for the SVM even. It
That's
doesn't
our
have to
Kate's
be.
name, by the way, in the bottom.
You can use any classifier.
Yeah, but what I mean is that if I can use PCA on top of X8,
Yeah.
Yeah, you could, but it's just like you kernelize it. So it's the same thing.
Yeah, we gotta
I mean,
get that
you
locked
could do
down.
it. I don't know what it will do. It will reduce the damage.
It just takes so much.
I don't know
I mean, I don't know
how
my
many will be
experience finding
important,
this.
but PCA will try to find the more important damage.
Yeah. I
I've
get
done
so
it
many people
before,
don't
but
follow up.
that PCA doesn't do a good
I mean,
job.
Yeah,
I remember
I
when
don't
email
think
first
that's the right
started
place
coming
to
out,
put it.
everyone was like very
It's too
responsive.
late, it's
And
too
now
late.
It's horrible.
Because it's not, it's only like 1,000, how many?
FC7 is
No,
4,000.
I'm just talking
Yeah,
about.
it's only 4,000.
Don't
It's not that
respond to
many.
emails.
If you go further back, you have a lot more to choose from.
Yeah, it's hard. I feel guilty.
But that's the whole point.
So
that's why
Yeah.
I gotta start just saying.
So it's suggested even for A1PCA,
Inbox zero has to be a rule, that way you don't have to.
L1 is tougher.
Mark as unread.
Impossible.
Because that way I don't do it.
I
My
can't
my
do
starter
it.
box has like 110,000 messages.
Yeah.
So-
That's not mine.
A1
This is Jason Corso.
Oh, yeah.
He's like,
The
yeah,
changes
the day I sat down, block out
Right.
3 hours of time to do it.
Correct.
Email.
Yeah.
Okay,
So if I want to
Inbox zero.
try to improve on
He's-
that, I
he's very
can
tough.
manually have outliers on my
Change
change
your
data
business
set.
as an so I'm hesitating kind of.
Because I'm
Yeah,
doing.
if there are no outliers,
I
they do about
this year.
Probably just had to change it.
Yeah.
There's
no,
not that.
But actually, he told me via email, oh, I'd be happy with this.
Yeah. Yeah, he was here last year,
So what are you working with?
May
I'm working
2016.
with Dr. Saver.
Okay.
And I'm
Has,
also working
we
with
had
Dr.
David Crandall come out to Western Europe?
Because
Because he really likes this area.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we had an idea.
Because he came and gave a talk here, like you weren't here when he came, like he came 3 or 4 years ago to us. But because he interned at Kodak.
Yeah.
I mean, he really, I know he really likes this area, so he
Came from
came.
the first I'm talking.
Oh, yeah.
But this is so shallow layers.
That Larry, yeah, you know the story about the blue noise masking? So he had all these pants of blue noise masking, but he stole the
You
idea
can
from
try
Larry
it.
Ray. Because Larry talked about a conference
we
where he was
don't
doing.
wanna do it, okay.
No, here was the deal.
He's like the nemesis of the.
Right. So he got all these patents on Blue Noise Slithering after talking to Larry about it, and
Okay.
then U of R like sued Microsoft.
The reason
to get royalties from users. And they got a bunch of money, but then Microsoft was sued back because Microsoft managed to uncover one of Larry's earlier patents that described it all. And so Larry actually got called, he got deposed by a bunch of Microsoft lawyers, and the case was over. And then the judge ruled, if Microsoft's right, so basically the judge invalidated the patents because Larry's patent.
So I'm still reading your paper. So I'll send it back to you.
Okay.
By Friday.
I'm sure I had
I think I
names.
Trying
emailed
to
3 out of 4,
Yeah.
1 or 2 I did email.
submit it.
But I'm scared of just sending out these
Still, I don't know
emails.
about the format.
Yeah, that's always a risk. You gotta do it sequentially, otherwise you're in a predicament.
Actual, like.
Actually, if you know anybody, maybe a town is driving or something, is a hard time. But what's
Any
looking for
double
a
column
Ford
or not?
professor who's got lots
Oh,
of,
they just,
history.
I don't.
I looked at the LaTeX files.
I guess Kevin Parker fits
Is
that,
that
but it's
double
sort of
column?
like,
Yeah. But
you
you
know,
can
it's
try
not
sending it,
central
we'll see if
domain,
we're gonna complain.
Yeah.
But I think he's a
Okay.
good catch.
I mean, this is
Yeah, 'cause they
expanding
don't
the
give
signal
any
processing as well.
insights.
Yeah, and that's why I
I
tend
wonder,
to.
like,
All right.
Okay.
you like see,
See you.
he does a lot of ultrasound signal processing stuff. I don't know if that's.
Where's
He's an
the-
Chris,
ultrasound guy over
well, that was
here.
fun. Thank you for.
Thank you.
I think it was one of Kevin's students line going
Do you have a question?
Well, just
Yeah.
the
But it'd be more
for the
eventual
ATT
than
method,
process.
right, you'll have a low score.
Well, so
I was
everything
wondering
is
whether
set
it
for
was
that.
just
Everything is, I
averaging,
didn't send it, because I don't think you know, so I wanted.
voting between two
I think it's
answers,
like
one has the right
October
answer, one has the wrong answer.
Yeah.
And you have.
Jill,
to
why
choose
don't we,
the
I
expert,
was thinking we
right?
should advertise our little
Between the
mail
two.
list thing or
So
something.
is
I think we
that-
should start
Yeah,
advertising.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
They only
Actually, the
use
call
one
for
day.
papers I could do, I don't
Okay.
need to keep.
Yeah, the call for papers, that's what I
Well,
want.
they-
Yeah.
All right, if you don't,
Yeah,
from
so
by the end of the week.
it's basically
Gold
someone
is,
has the
you know,
right
Friday
answer.